Welcome. We're going to get started. My name is Daniela Bleichmer. I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities, and I am delighted to welcome you to one of the Levan's book chats, where we have the wonderful opportunity to celebrate and discuss a recent book publication by a USC author. Today's event is co-sponsored by the USC East Asian Studies Center and the USC Center for the Premodern World. Its author brings together many centers, many worlds. We will be hearing about Sonya Lee's recently published Temples in the Cliffside, Buddhist Art in Sichuan, published by the University of Washington Press in 2021. For those of you joining us for the first time, we really love it if people turn their cameras on when they can. It really helps to feel that we are together. We will begin with Sonya giving just very brief remarks about her book, and then she will be joining conversation by Wendy Adamek from the University of Calgary and Tamara Sears from Rutgers University, and the conversation will be moderated by our colleague Joshua Goldstein from USC. After about 30 minutes of discussion, we will open the floor for questions from the audience, and Josh will be moderating those. So thank you so much for joining us. And Sonya, you have the mic. Please tell us about your new book.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniela. I just want to start off by thanking you and Isabella for the invite and putting this event together. And I would also like to thank my colleagues, Wendy, Tamara, and Josh for joining us today in this conversation. And I very much look forward to the questions and comments they have, and also from the audience. Now, I'm not going to talk as much about my book. I was told to only talk about it in 5 minutes or less. And so it's about a very unique type of architecture that's actually quite common across Asia. It's called cave temples, and they can be found in India, Central Asia, East Asia, and everywhere. And certain forms of them can also be found in West Asia, like in Turkey. The kinds that I focus on in this book are mostly related to Buddhism, Buddhist practices built, sponsored by Buddhist practitioners. And they are what some people would call outstanding examples of art embedded in nature, because these structures really capture the interaction of art and the environment over a very long period of time. So a lot of the sites that I deal with in this book and elsewhere in Asia have very long lifespan. You're talking about hundreds, over 1,000 years long. And some of the most enduring examples first built around the turn of the Common Era. So they are over 2,000 years long. And so the subject itself offers you all kinds of really interesting perspectives. And one thing I'm trying to do here is really try to integrate the past into the discussion that we have about the present and also the future, especially with regard to climate change and sustainability. And I think looking at these sites really offer all kinds of interesting perspectives. And so I really want diversity of perspectives in this book. So, and that's why I look at different groups of stakeholders to see what sustainability or what they try to sustain through their involvement at these sites, because these sites been around for so long. It's not just about that moment when they were first built or created, but also how people repurpose them over time. And so, so there's a lot to consider. And I think it's, when we talk about how to integrate all this modern contemporary concerns about the environment into study of really old things, it's really about how we use evidence. And so in this book, I really try to form different disciplinary alliances, things that art historians might not have explore as much. So like heritage study, art conservation, and even political economy and all those things that I never really learned when I was a student. And so I learned how to calculate the GDP and all those things. And, it's a challenge, but I also learned how to interpret, numbers from very technical analysis of stone and all those things. So I find it very exciting, and I hope that it can open up a lot of new conversations in our field and also beyond. So I would just stop here and let Josh direct the traffic.
Okay, thanks for that. I think the next stage is that Professor Sears and Professor Edemek will ask some questions and start just a conversation that we'll do for about a half hour or 25, 30 minutes, and then we'll open up to the audience and everyone can ask more questions. All right, go ahead, whoever wants to start.
Well, I'll go ahead.
No, please, you go ahead.
What? Oh, sorry. So I want to thank Sonya and the organizers for making this possible. First of all, I really appreciated the chance to read this book before it even hits the shelves. And it's very exciting because for me, because I've also been working on cave sites and cliff sites in the north. And I really appreciated Sonya's various bridges with contemporary concerns and theorization. And I guess a question that kept emerging for me was one of those bridges that I find very intriguing, discussion of new materiality theorization. And I'm going to just focus in my question. I'm focusing on the relational agency aspect of that discussion of creations of sites and objects in relation to communities, and understanding causation in a Buddhist sense in terms of relational responses and networks and interdependence, all that good stuff. But one thing I grappled with in my work is that relational agency in the Tong, of course, includes merit, includes the question of devotion, merit as a motivation, belief in the causality of karma, and intentional action having in and of itself a power in a different register than the new materiality theorists are talking about as we go into social construction of identity, relating it to quantum indeterminability and all of those issues that are in our radar. So basically what I'm interested in is how would you think of that bridge between devotional faith in the power of merit and our current devotional faith that we're understanding something about relationality, if that makes any sense whatsoever. But that's what.
Well, I mean, it's a big challenge to find evidence to interpret someone else's intention, and now we're in a time when we don't just interpret people's intention; we also want to talk about things' intention, and so
yes.
It's quite a challenge. I think in this book, I'm not trying to go post-human in that sense because it's very hard to do. And a lot of the things that I talk about are still very much grounded in human experiences in a particular time and place. But at the same time, there are concerns that are quite universal. And so you raise this question about merits, devotion, and faith. And I think it also underscores the importance of religion in our discussion of a lot of these contemporary problems. And it's not something that's not as much on the radar today, but it certainly has been like this in pre-modern period. So many things are very much connected to our, I think nowadays we use religiosity rather than just religion, because you cannot really put it down to a very established religious system. But it's something, you know, spirituality mixed with worship of something. And so, so in this book, I'm trying to focus on communities that sponsored and built these sites. And of course, you know, that's a pretty specific context because most of them were related to Buddhism, and Buddhism has all kinds of manifestations in China. Nowadays, we use Buddhisms in the plural form. And so it's a particular kind in Sichuan. And of course, even within Sichuan, this whole region, we also see different variations. And so, so I interpreted sites along those lines, and things change over time. And oftentimes, if you break this further down into different groups of people who use those sites, and you have the monastic who certainly have more advanced understanding of doctrines and practices, rituals, and then you have visitors who know something, but they want to be part of this, and so they are not, you know, they don't really. So within this, you know, very big picture of a say Buddhism, you have also variation. And then you also have people work at these sites who might not have been religious at all, like the restorers I talked about in one chapter. And so, so my strategies really try to bring all these different perspectives in a somewhat coherent form, and let the reader to see it. Because, you know, if I just focus on one group and talk about it, I mean, that's what can be done and has been done in previous you know, scholarship. You get one interpretation, and I'm trying to bring a bit more into it. And then of course I have my own take on certain topics and questions, and so it's sort of related to how I shaped the book. And part one, it's really about my response to a lot of things in today's discussion about the Anthropocene. You know, there's certain things I feel important to address and add to what's been said. And so, so that's how I talk about the relational agency.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's very rich. There's so much that you bring in.
Yeah, no, I have to say that I have a whole variety of different kinds of questions, but I wanted to just first congratulate you, because this is really, I mean, it was a real privilege to read this book and get this nice preview, because it's a really beautifully written kind of meditation, not, you know, that goes far beyond the kind of typical examination of the historical circumstances of the creation of caves, but really thinks through longue durée in ways that I think are extremely fruitful. I think methodologically there's a lot that that anyone can get out of this book. And just to sort of frame, for those of you who don't know me, to frame my perspective on this, I'm a South Asianist. I work on medieval India and primarily, but with, you know, with an investment also on in how to sort of bring in dialogue, like with between kind of approaches to environment in medieval India with the kind of continuing engagements with the environment today, and to think about how to frame conversations about climate change in relationship to not just this very presentist Anthropocene centric model, but also in relationship to a much longer durée. So this, I found this very inspiring as a kind of way of really beginning to do this effectively. You know, one of the things I found surprising about this book was how compelling the scientific and technical sections were to read. They were really, they were actually, you know, they beautifully written. You know, I have other more theoretically inclined questions, but I thought maybe this was a good place to ask you to talk a little bit more about how you came to that aspect of this particular body of research, of that a very close technical understanding that then sheds completely new light, not just on the moments of historical creation, but also on, like, for example, as you turn to late in the book, it sheds new light on conservators and their own sensitivity to sustainability in the present day, to sort of counteract criticisms of the transformation of sites that takes on, you know, completely new aesthetic. But I think you kind of show how that the choices that were made were really about ecological, environmental sustainability, and not so much about what, you know, about visual modifications.
Great. Well, thank you. I mean, I have to say, I have to say, a lot of South Asianists have been doing a lot of this kind of work. So Tamara is one of the pioneers, and then a lot of her colleagues. And so what I'm trying to do here is really to bring heritage conservation in dialogue with art history. I think one thing that's in some way missing in our training of graduate students today is connoisseurship. I mean, it somehow became a dirty word in the field, and you know, we need to separate original objects from fakes or copies, and then we have attach all kinds of meanings or connotations to these terms and these categories of objects. And so I did a bit of this kind of training because when I first started grad school, my advisor was not very interested in taking us to see things in museums. So I got frustrated. Then I went to Japan, and my professor there was very much interested in asking us to tell, you know, how do you look at a thing and be able to say this is authentic or not, and all those things. So, but still, it's not a, it's a very subjective type of exercise. And so when I began to learn more about conservation, then I realized there might be something, it's still very subjective, but I think there are more objective things that we can rely on. And so I got into it, and I took classes, I took professional workshops, and try to learn. I mean, I still a very bad student in terms of doing organic chemistry and all those things, but there are certain things that quite revealing in terms of numbers. And so, like in chapter 1, when I talk about the big Buddha, 62-meter tall, 10-story building, pretty much, a lot of people focus on the height because, you know, they try to measure it. I mean, it's a challenge. I don't know. You don't get a measuring tape that long and do it. It's impossible. But I feel that may not be the way to really understand the significance of this place, because it's not really the height, it's really the scale that's what we need to understand, like how much stone they removed from the cliff. And so I can try to figure out how I can come up with a measurement. So it's actually a civil engineering question. And so I try to get the measurements myself. I mean, there are a lot of things you can do. I think it's kind of American culture to DIY a lot of things. So I went to the sites many times, and I brought a laser meter with me and tried to get some measurements. Of course, you know, that's not good enough. And then I learned that, you know, nowadays you have drone photography, and those things can actually be very useful. So in the past you do satellites, but now you can do drones, so it's a lot closer and more accurate. And so once you generate a bunch of data, you need to interpret. And so luckily for the sites, there was a really good study done by Japanese scholars 20 years ago, because it's a team of engineers or historians trying to figure out the labor involved in building these colossal Buddhas. And I put, you know, those numbers together and see there's certain things that you can compare, some of the things you cannot, then you need to also explain the differences. And so that's how I developed the analysis. And it also depends on what data you want to get. I think in another chapter, I also look at lacquer, because, you know, it's a different kind of data you're going to get. And I try to read through like a massive technical study they did on the gilding done on the Buddha, because before you preserve anything, you need to propose methods. to show that, it's actually viable before they actually do anything. So they produce this massive study. They spend years trying to figure out what would the best way to put the gold leaf back on the surface. And it's tricky because there's so much water coming out of that surface, because this water flows through of capillarity, because water rises from the ground and all these different factors. And so so it's a different kind. And then they realize that maybe you go back to the traditional method might work better than any kind of adhesive produced by other advanced countries. So it's not you measure the effectiveness of the method and the material by how well it fits within a certain environment. There's no standardized way of measuring the effectiveness of these methods and technologies. So it's what I mean by eco-compatibility. And so I'm trying to get at that concept by using some real examples. And I developed that sense by interviewing these restorers. They walk me through the whole process. I was tempted to ask if I could actually try it myself, but of course they won't allow me to do it. But at least, they won't kick me out from the sites. They just let me just stand and watch what they did. Mm-hmm. And it's not easy work. So so that's what I would add to Tamara's question.
No, and actually, if I can follow up on that really quickly, because I love that section on lacquer, or the lacquer technology, and I think it also what you just brought out was one of the crucial elements of your methodology that is so frequently missing, I think, in art historical studies, is that ethnographic element, because you draw on so many different kinds of sources, from the very close technical analysis to the iconographic analysis to the thinking through spatial and architectural sort of experiences approaching and movement through, so very, these larger art historical methods, but you also draw extensively on a wide range of textual sources, and also this ethnography, which I think also really changes and shapes the interpretation of those sites. So I thought, and particularly in the to that point, going back to lacquerware, I think it's also the suitability of the environment. But I think one of the things your book brings out is that the environment also is not necessarily stable. It changes over time. And that's what is the right solution in one moment is not necessarily the right solution in another. And I thought that was extremely useful to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, I think, thank you for bringing this point up. I mean, it's so hard to capture when there's something that keeps changing. And so it's sort of at the very foundation of my conceptualization of caves, because they keep changing. And how do you talk about a subject that's like that? And I think when things are static, stays the same, it's a lot easier, but it's not quite close to the reality we all deal with. So I think it's challenging in that sense.
You're still muted, Wendy.
Yeah, I got it. So yes, I was really taken with the various kinds of technological interventions that you were talking about, from the first construction of Leshan all the way through to these modern restorations. And I was struck by the theme that you mentioned at the end of using traditional techniques, because there's this long process of experimentation. And a few examples for those of you who may not have had a chance to read the book yet. I mean, the building of the colossal Buddha on the Min River, Sonya brings in other interventions, that this was part of other kinds of engineering to help deal with the currents and the flooding, and earlier interventions that included. I was fascinated by the idea of sinking boulders in large bamboo baskets at strategic points on the river, or at a later site, growing a belt of trees to protect the temple rather than a wall. And just thinking about how, these kinds of interventions, if we still paid attention to that micro level of management of environment, or to the extent that we can do that, we would be better off in many ways than these, these massive projects that we keep experimenting with. So I really appreciated your sensitivity to these sort of technological environmental details throughout the history of the projects you were talking about.
Great. Well, thank you.
And one,
Yeah.
go ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead.
No, I just want to say, and one aim I want to make it work in this book is to look at these very large scale cultural productions as part of our discussion about anthropogenic activities, because agriculture is getting a very bad name in how we study the impact of the humans on the environment, on the earth. But if you look at the scale, it's quite massive, and there's people diverted like at least 100,000 men to build this Buddha, and the resources that's being taken up to do it. And yet, you don't get this kind of economic output, if you try to understand it in terms that we normally do, to look at industrial productions or agricultural production. And so what do we exactly do with these monuments then? Are we going to give them credits for diverting labor from otherwise producing more crops and, growing a population and all those things? Or so I think it's a way to sort of bring up or to develop a more holistic way of thinking about human productions, to understand these big climatic trends. I just stop here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I remember attending a talk in 2016 about frantic attempts to plant trees in the desert above the Mogao caves to try to keep the erosion from pouring over the over the edge into the cave site. And just thinking, wow, what if people had had started doing that at the beginning of restoration efforts, if something like your book was available that talked about environmental conservation in different sorts of ways. I mean, maybe this is a beginning for a new kind of conservation that also works with environmental projects. I'd love to see that happen at Baoshan, which is surrounded by coal mining. The site I worked on, which is surrounded by mountaintop removal coal mining. So
yes, I've been there, and the pollution is just astounding.
Oh, yeah, it's really. So yeah, I hope your book inspires conservationists worldwide to start, taking this as opportunity for environmental restoration.
We'll see.
That actually leads me, if I can ask a slightly self-indulgent question about something that I've been thinking about that doesn't come up so much in your book, but that maybe you'd be in a good position to remark upon, which is, so I've got a side project where I've been thinking a lot about caves in the Indian Deccan, mostly Hindu, but also to some extent Buddhist, particularly in relationship to monsoon management and disaster prevention in the 6th through 8th centuries. And I've become increasingly interested in engagements with earthquakes. Because when you're dealing with mountainous terrain, you're dealing with potential for seismic events. So I've been drawing on work done by a Romanian scholar, Eugen Shurtin, who's a specialist on Buddhist religion, and who's argued for recognizing the relationship between references to earthquakes in Pali and Sanskrit sources, and the real potential for seismic activity, particularly in areas in which Buddhism especially flourished up in the Himalayas. And it's led to some great essay titles, such as, "Thus Have I Quaked" is just a great title. But so you mentioned earthquakes here and there. It comes up, chapter 5, the great Sichuan earthquake of 2008 that spurred the restoration of the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara. And you also mentioned elsewhere what is it? The mountain, it is the Mountain Gate rock, which shows some, traces of seismic activity in the past. I'm wondering, so in the case of India, I mean, the places I'm looking at are fairly stable. They're not prone necessarily to seismic activity, although there may well have been some kind of, when you have a mountain, whether or not there's actually a massive earthquake is irrespective to the idea of whether or not the potential is there. But what's been happening today, and when the Geological Survey of India conducted their geoscientific studies for the purpose of conserving these sites, one of the things they were recommending was trying to divert traffic. Because the increased automotive traffic and other kinds of human interventions have been causing micro seismic events. And so, and that's one of those more modern changes to the environment that's suddenly bringing about instability in a place which had been stable. And I know that in the case of the regions in which you're working, well, out of curiosity, when sort of looked up the science, and it looks like that's similarly the case. Wendy just mentioned coal mining, but there's been other sorts of human interventions that have been causing increasing seismic activity, which I think has probably led to the big earthquake in 2008. So I was wondering whether or not there's been any efforts by conservationists to mitigate the potential for damage brought about by this increased human activity, and if that's something, and if not, what you might recommend.
Well, I mean, Sichuan is definitely an earthquake-prone zone, and there's no way to get around it. So as far as I know, there's really no effort made to reduce the number of tourists, because I think, the number is still relatively small compared to other sites. So the one that has the most tourists is the big Leshan Buddha that has more than 3 million people. So that's and it's also a difficult question, because if you want to preserve a site, of course, one very conventional way of doing it just to build a fence around it and don't let anybody in. I think that happened before, but now the thinking now it's no, this is not, it's not good for the environment, not good for the local community. So we need to open it up and then try to find that very delicate balance. So and I think it's not just restricted to this site, but also everywhere in China and other parts of the world. How do you find that balance? How do you have this difficult conversation? And what's quite specific to China, for example, is that usually the local government and the businesses have a bit more say than others. And so you will need to have more to engage the other people who are also stakeholders, and sometimes they don't get their voices heard. So even though, earthquake is something that affects everyone, but only certain groups have more say than others. And so I think this is a problem, and I don't know how to resolve this. I think it will involve educating not just everybody, but educating each other about what benefit one can bring from your perspective. So I didn't really do it in this project, but I actually have a side project that's related to these questions, how to explain the benefits of conservation to people who have no access to, and conversely, how to have conservators listen to the concerns from the local villagers, for example. So those are important. And there's actually a restoration project where the conservators actually did a lot of talking and educating, and that's very unusual. And if you compare that to the one I talk about in the book, that is so heavy-handed top-down because it's the #1 conservation project in the country. So the government talked most of the time. And so these are not just, so it's a different kind of coordination, and that's closely related to how we can understand and think about sustainability. So it's a social coordination. And so that's something I will explain if they ever listen to me, that's great. But if not, then then I talk to other people.
I think there's time for one more question from one of the panelists, a kind of short one. And while that's happening, people who would like to ask questions, if you would maybe you could raise your hand in the participants thing, the blue hand, or you could raise your hand if you don't know how to do that. And I'll try to see you if you turn your camera on and start taking a list of people who want to ask questions. So whoever wants to ask one more question while that's going on, go ahead.
Would you like to go, Wendy?
Well, I want to make sure that participants have time. So if, I don't know, if anyone wants to, it's fine with me. If anyone wants to just raise their hand from the audience, I'm not. But not to waste our time with the author, I can also, I have endless questions. So with your analysis of the various sites having to do with Liu Benzun and the Baodingshan and then and other sites, that was very interesting. Though of course, you know, when you were writing it, I'm sure you didn't realize it would be coming out in the middle of a pandemic. But just I hadn't. It was very interesting to look at government responses, government differentiations between certain kinds of faith-based interventions were prohibited and certain kinds were accepted and encouraged. And Leo, so from what you were analyzing, it didn't seem like anything about the Liu Benzun cult was ever prohibited. Is that correct from what you found?
Yeah, it's a very strange case because we have the site that these people built, but we have very few textual records of who these people were. And so, you know, you're trying to interpret based on the site and also the images they left behind. And so, yes, I think it's also quite remote. And Sichuan is sort of like the Wild West in those periods. So if you get banned in the capital, you just go to Sichuan and you can do it. So I guess, you know, that might have happened. And but I think these people were serious. That's, you know, they have money to build something of this scale. So it's not like some very radical group that, you know, very on the fringe, but in fact they probably have some status in the local society, and they could sponsor people to do it for years because it's not like a day job. It takes decades to build a site like this. So yeah, so I don't think they were banned, but I think they were probably cautious. They don't want to leave behind any records, so maybe they might get arrested. So I don't know. I'm very baffled by what we have today. I think they're very intentionally secretive about their identity, but at the same time, you know, they have the site. So so
I know. I mean, it's, yeah, the site is so, I've been there. I've been to the Baodingshan, and wow, I mean, it's so elaborate, as you say, and yet it shares some features with, you know, like Sanjiejiao, which was even more secretive and left a couple of sites, but not very much. So yeah, it's fascinating.
Anybody who wants to, oh great, Daniela, go for it. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I am such an outsider to this that, you know, I know nothing, as Sonya knows, as my colleague. But one thing that was very interesting to me about this conversation, as, you know, somebody who works on the early modern period, so not quite as deeper history as you do, but still some centuries ago, is that I, as a historian, the place of not just the subject, but the place where I spend my time is the past, right? Like it's about the past, but also placed in the past. And what I found fascinating about this conversation is that it seems that through this book, you are looking at the past today, right? And that's a different sense of what history is and what the work of the historian, art historian is. And so I just wanted to hear more about that, because normally, you know, if I work on the 1500s, I feel very comfortable in the 1500s. It doesn't even occur to me to talk about the 21st century, right? Because period is such the ultimate category for historians. And so I just wanted to hear more about that.
Sure. I struggle with this a lot because, as you said, you pick a period and you specialize in it, and you do everything about that period, you know, to explain the project. But in this book, I try to break that mold because it's not just about the present, but actually going deeper in the past, so the prehistory as well as the future. So I wanted to have this kind of flexibility to go around, not because, you know, it's fun, but because you go with the evidence to really support what you're trying to say. And sometimes you have a lot of evidence that allows you to go really deep into the past. Like the case of the big Leshan Buddha, you know, there's a very well documented history of technology, water control, and all those things, and also a ephemeral praxis to build his tombs in the mountain, and that's quite you know, it's a lot of material that you can draw on, but I cannot really go that far in the future with that site, so I sort of focus on that aspect because, you know, I want the chapter to be coherent. I don't like the, you know, it can be done, you know, you can write an entire book on a single place from past to the future, you know, then you can cover the chronological span like that. But sometimes, you know, you run out of material, good material to work with. And so I sort of jump around. I map out a region that I think it makes sense, and both geographically and also culturally and also ecologically. And then I sort of move around and see what I can, I have the best material to work with, and yet can tell a story that also involves the present and the future. So I think that's one concept that I feel quite compelled. So there's a very important historian working on modern Asia, someone named Prasad Dura, and he wrote a book about the crisis of global modernity in Asia. And so he's really trying to integrate the study of religion in how we think about modernity and all the problems that came with it. And so he uses the term dialogical transcendence to really try to say certain religious traditions allows you to go beyond this boundary that's framed by time. Though when you go to a cave temple, you actually feel you go somewhere else. So it's not even like the past or the future, but it's somewhere else. And so it has this kind of flexibility. I kind of really like it. And of course, he didn't really talk about caves, but he uses other Asian religions to talk about the importance of drawing on that to think about this, a sustainable future for everyone. And of course, you know, it's also his critique of Eurocentric model of modernity and all those things. And so I'm sort of respond to his idea by saying, sort of using, you know, real examples to talk about it. And I think when you deal with a subject like this, a cave temple, I think you're more flexible as opposed to, say, a book. I think that's limited in some sense. So I don't know, maybe Daniela has a different example that maybe she can, you know, maybe explain a different way than I have done here.
Can I follow up a little bit with that? I'm interested in the changing, I guess, in obviously different people experience these sites very differently. But I guess as somebody, again, who's I read parts of the book, and I'm definitely an outsider to this field. If you know, you've got these wonderful descriptions and poems of some of the people going to some of these sites a long time ago, and then you have, you know, destination tourism now where 3 million people are funneled to certain places. And I'm just wondering what you think in kind of is it worth comparing these experiences and then talking about how they might have been changing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I included in that book, and as I said earlier, I really like to have diversity of opinions because one size doesn't fit all, and even though when I use this record, it's still very much limited. You know very well, Josh, that records are usually written by elite males in the past in China, and so the mindsets, the viewpoints are in some way bound by these conditions. And I study religious art because you actually get a glimpse of other people, especially women, children, older people. They left behind very cryptic, just a little bit of writings, but not a whole lot. But they also sponsor these projects, so I'm trying to bring these voices back in some way. And of course, nowadays, you look at contemporary periods, everybody loves to share what they think. I would post a chat in social media. I've been here, I share a photo and then I say, what aside, you share your thoughts. And we don't get that kind of material from the past. And so I'm trying to, try to explain the importance of seeing these diversity of opinions. It's just that we don't have those from the past, and that's as far as we could go in terms of material evidence. We probably will need something else to really bring these people back to life. I think in archaeology, for example, you can actually study human remains that can actually tell you a lot about the health, about the diet, what they did. But of course, you just look for evidence to support, to build a story.
If I can follow up on that, I mean, because I think what you're describing is the difference between perceiving what they did and what they thought, how they engaged. And you get at many I was reminded as you were making those comments of this moment, I think early in the book, where you talk about Fan Chengda's poetic exclamation as he sort of gets to the top of the Lingyun Buddha, and
Mm-hmm.
suddenly, that sense of divine transcendence. And that's, I think, is always what's so remarkable about rock cut architecture, about mountainous landscapes, is that you get to the top of that. And it's, it's almost hard to be human centric when you're faced with such vastness and with such incredible beauty. And to that end, I was almost thinking, and that's one way of getting at what he thought in that kind of interrelationship, or the interconnection that you point out within Buddhism between human action, divine will, and nature. But I want to, if I can ask a question or almost invert that question, I'm almost wondering whether or not you get there's any sorts of investment in inverting the gaze, where the idea is, when Fan Chengda climbs up to the top and looks out, what he's also doing is getting a view of what the Buddha is seeing. Is there ever that sense that the gaze that matters is not necessarily the one that is human, but the one that is the deity presiding within or looking out from the mountain? And this, I know that this is not a post-human type of question. It's just about how humans might have perceived the cosmos in this way.
Yeah, I would say that the whole genre of these colossal Buddhas is really not about how human looks at them, but it's let the Buddhas look out for you. And I talked about the original look of the site, that there was a shelter around it, but there are windows so that the Buddha can look out. You can see his hands. If you take a boat out in the middle of the river, you see the whole thing. But of course, you climb it, you only see parts of it. And so there are many those subtle strategies to make you feel small when you encounter something so big. And you're a size of the Buddha's toe, literally, at that site. And so that really brings you to wonder about other things. And so that's sort of related to what I mentioned earlier about dialogical transcendence. These sites really make you think, to take like a step outside your comfort zone and think about what's possible out there. So it's not maybe about the past or the future, but maybe it's like a completely different realm, or what you feel like I'm leaving my body for a moment and try to imagine what transcendence might feel, or to really be part of that cosmos, that the Buddha presides over. I mean, it's so much about imagination, and of course, I can say whatever I want, but I also want to ground it with the historical material, and that's what people said. Like this poet Fountain that said, and he sort of captured some of that in that little piece that he wrote.
We still have a few more minutes for questions, so either from audience or from
Well, I could follow up on that because that sort of raised another question, which was again those modes of viewing, of being able to see in parts versus being able to see from afar, because I think that's that's always the key with anything monumentally carved into rock. And that's also true of Bamyan and the kind of conversations, for example, about conservation and restoration. Does the Buddha sculpture really need to be there in order for its presence to be felt? So, there are all these questions that come out from that, but that brings me to another question I had as I was thinking through, was the way in which the landscape sometimes then becomes part of the composition of the work. So again, just in the Lingyun Buddha, for example, the way in which the trees coming up atop of the mountain almost create form kind of part of the iconography of the Buddha. In Indian context, at least, you'd expect to see like the branches spouting above his head. And I'm wondering whether or not those were kind of some of the things that we can get at as part of the composition, where the caves become naturalized into the landscape, and the landscape becomes part of the visual composition of the image. So I was wondering if you got that sense at all as well.
Yeah, I do. That shelter that was built earlier got destroyed and never got rebuilt. And so it really literally became part of the landscape. I just want to say that I think nowadays, the local community is actually trying to raise money to rebuild that shelter. And I don't know if that's a decision to be made by the people closest to it. But the sites actually got flooded quite often. And so if you build a building and, if the water level rises to his knee, then, the building is not going to last very long. And so it might not be a very productive way of protecting the Buddha in that sense. It's an ongoing project. And so it's a challenge for us to say, does it really end? No, it doesn't. And it just have a different look. Maybe in 10 years, maybe they still manage to build this massive structure in front. And then maybe 20 years later, a flood went destroyed it. So it will be an ongoing project. And so I think that what makes these sites so fascinating, unless, there's a bomb completely destroyed or an earthquake. But still, the case of Bamyan, even though the images are gone, people still talk about them. And so it's really part of this legacy. And so that's why I'm very fascinated by these sites, that they actually tell us so much about why people want to preserve them or sustain them. And there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from them. I just want to add one more note, because the publisher said that the publication date is December 2021, and they sent me a copy around that time. But then because the book was printed in South Korea, and there's been a 3 months delay in the shipment. So, but they just told me that they will ship those out. They got the copies recently and will be very able to ship them out. So I hope that it will become available very soon.
Well, it looks beautiful from what I saw of it.
Yeah. No, the proofs are gorgeous, and it's a beautifully produced book.
Yeah, the images are great. Yeah.
Sonya, I'm glad you mentioned that, because normally I wave a copy of the book to the camera, but in this case I couldn't. So I wasn't sure when you, oh, there you go.
Yeah, one and
thank
only
you.
copy.
Yes, thank you. So we are almost at time. It is my turn to thank Josh Goldstein for moderating, and Wendy Alamek and Tamara Sears for joining Sonya Lee in conversation about her new book. I also wanted to mention that Sonya is giving in just a couple of weeks a lecture on Zoom from this book at sponsored by the Huntington Library. So I have posted those details on the chat. If you want to hear more about the book and from the book, the link is there to reserve. Thank you all so much for joining us for one of these book chats from the Levan Institute. Thank you to our co-sponsors today, the East Asian Studies Center and the Center for the Premodern World. And we will have our last book chat of the year in a month, in April, where we will be talking about an altogether different subject, celebrating a new book by Andrew Lakoff in sociology, co-written with Stephen Collier from Berkeley, The Government of Emergency, Vital Systems Expertise, and the Politics of Security. So thank you for joining us, Sonya. Again, many, many congratulations on your wonderful new book.
Thank you all for coming today.